to Lucy and to Anna for inviting me. It was really a great pleasure to come up. I guess I'm the token Guattariist in this conference, and perhaps this will become evident as I speak. But basically what I'm going to be talking about today is a very small, I think it's 7 or 8 pages of 1,000 Plateaus, where Deleuze and Guattari talk about demonology. Now, I've given you a ruse with the title because Lucy said, well, we're talking about the text, so I just put text at the end of the word demonological, but that's actually not about text. However, I will be talking quite a bit about Lovecraft. Now, I'm going to contentiously, and possibly Ian's going to slaughter me for doing this, suggest that things like Lovecraft and demonology are actually concepts rather than percepts that we can negotiate as works of art. But we'll have a little play with that later. And I'm also mainly talking about things like activism. My big question at the moment is, how does a philosopher put their body where their pen is, so to speak? Which is why perhaps the Guattari symbiosis of clinician and philosopher comes in. All right, enough rant. Deleuze and Guattari critique taxonomy as not made up of a series of opposites, but all alterity as fallen man, first biblical reference. One could be tempted, second biblical reference, to say that this alone aligns the subjugated terms, animal, woman, children, and so forth, as necessarily sympathetic to each other's conditions through various mechanisms of power, oppression, and resistance. Now, of course, in Becoming, these are the kind of, devolutionary alterity. We have woman, child, animal, music, imperceptible. The concept has been suggested by many animal rights activists, feminists and queer theorists, also known as perverts. In other areas, theorists of the posthuman suggest that there is no longer a category of human, or more precisely, the category of human was always the mythical zenith of an equally mythical arboreal structure which systematised human subjectivity through religious, metaphysical and evolutionary discourses. So these were concepts which created referents that were mimetic functions of self-realisation. So nature was a mimetic function of the self-realisation of the human rather than being an observation, whether or not that observation was considered infinitely outside. So instead of God making man, secular scientists now make their own possibility of dominance through discourses that demarcate the human, capital M, as a hermeneutic and given natural phenomenon. That sounded like a real hairy-chested feminist thing to say, didn't it? Human. Anyway, you know what I mean. While many majoritarian. While many feminists, particularly Irigaray, see the bifurcation between man and woman as the most obvious and deterministic binary, I would argue that that which divides man from animal encompasses a far wider colonisation of life through discourse. As feminists struggle with the conundrum of how to define ourselves, without reifying or essentialising the female, all other entities drop away. Animal entities, more correctly non-human animals, in their almost infinite varieties, pose a far greater challenge to thought. This is my argument, and it's a pretty contentious one. However, it is the first memory of the sorcerer, which is the pack. According to Deleuze and Guattari, the first memory of the sorcerer is the propagation of a pack, which is the state, not kind, of animal. So certain challenges to thought occur through, becoming animal rights, be it through activism, philosophy or science. So these span, or art really, these span the different elements of what is philosophy. Closing the chasm between the human and the animal is like closing the gap between discourse and non-discourse, which would create a discourse, one word, between thought and the unthinkable but nonetheless necessary, and between our own relationships with our human selves as what Guattari calls an ecosophy. So the second memory of a sorcerer is this kind of ecosophy, the closing of the gap, which is demonic activism. The first memory of a sorcerer is the act of packing, the state or propagation of an entity. The second is the so-called conundrum that is, within a pack there must be a demon or a head. And so here is where we create the demonic packed pack. Deleuze and Guattari emphasise that between the two there is threshold and fibre, symbiosis or passage between heterogeneities. This is the third memory of the sorcerer, which is that after we have packed And after we have created an alliance with the demon, we realise that as sorcerers, with our demonic relationship, we have become fibre or symbiosis. Now, this fibre is not so much a threshold as the continuous line where all thresholds occur. So it's not relation, but production. So our encounter with the demon is not relation, but production. Or what they say, the demon is not deception, which is mimicry of characteristics, but it's treason, which is what Guattari would call in Chaosmosis a traversal of kingdom, or what Deleuze and Guattari call inter-kingdom desire. I'm sorry if I sound a little bit pedagogic at the moment, but I'm just not sure if you know this little tiny bit. So I'm going to sound a little bit condescending and pedagogic. Excuse me if I do. Despite the problems of unspeech or unthought in the face of pure alterity, this is a quote, Deleuze and Guattari state, becoming can and should be qualified as becoming animal, even in the absence of a term that would be the animal become, end quote. While non-human animals cannot negotiate through human discourse, they each, not each species, but each animal, emits power, hieties, singularities of force with which we and they can enter into a relation. So in terms of the deception versus treachery, in animal rights, it is the ethical packing itself which is treacherous to the human, not the adoption of a surrogate identity for which we would fight. So it's the state, not the kind. This is the difficulty of animal rights, because you're packing with something you don't know you're packing for. Okay, salient to this is the idea of the hybrid. What is a hybrid? A hybrid is something that is, for want of a better use of the term, the threshold half and half becoming animal. So traditionally we talk about hybrids as, in classical mythology, the minotaur, the centaur, those kinds of things. And these are usually born of sterile unions. So the hybrid cannot reproduce, but the hybrid is often born of an abominable relationship. So, for example, the union between Leda and her swan lover resulted in the beautiful but destructive Clytemnestra and Helen. Pasiphae's love for a white bull produced Phaedra, whose incestuous desires resulted in the death of her stepson. The so-called elephant man, Joseph Merrick, wolf children and other victims of congenital deformities have the malformations which cause their bodies to deviate from the human, named after animals. The archetype animal is analogy rather than threshold encounter. And so these are the three kind of problematic, they're the three orders of animal that Deleuze and Guattari go through. The first is the Oedipal animal, which is the little happy puppy dog, which is the exchange infant. The second is this kind of collective unconscious Jungian archetype animal. And then the third is the becoming animal term, which I'll get into later. But these are some examples of things that would like to be considered hybrids but pretty much aren't. Now, the first and most obvious one, which both they and animal rights activists criticise, are zoophiles. These are people who have sex with animals. Zoophiles are not becoming animal, but they're going steady with their Oedipal animal boyfriends and girlfriends. The Oedipal puppy baby no longer knows its own dogginess and is forced into a becoming human, albeit becoming child. Similarly, Donna Haraway warns against the Oedipalisation of dogs as surrogate children, but at the same time she claims the dog-human relation is a hybrid one, yet nonetheless her dog term is a trained dog and the dog is becoming human, whereas Deleuze and Guattari state, in reality the animal captured by man is deterritorialised by human force. In terms of animal rights, and this is another quote, the deterritorialised animal force, in turn, precipitates and intensifies the deterritorialisation of the deterritorialising human force. And so one of the reasons that I'm interested in the demonic and sorcerers is that sorcerers take animals as demons, acknowledging their invocation. So when the sorcerer invokes the werewolf, they know it's a becoming animal, but it's not a real animal. There are no werewolves. We're not sort of fetishising real werewolves and potentially Oedipalising them. And they also talk about vampires, and I'm not sure what a vampire is. Like, it's obviously a hybrid, but perhaps it's more of this kind of fibre threshold, which is multi-thresholds, because it's kind of half dead and undead and half girly and half masculine, and there's a lot of stuff going on. But they're the two examples that they use, the werewolf and the vampire. Now, certain hybrids are celebrated in postmodernity, and and they're not necessarily taken as aberrations, but as fetishizations of experimental sexuality, subjectivity, and transgressive behaviour, which, of course, both Foucault and Deleuze have expressed disdain for the transgressive subject as a reactive rather than an active or creative force. So, the kind of trendy postmodern hybrid is really a bit of a shopping list capitalist hybrid at its worst. Transgressive subjectivity is an enunciation of identity, announcing acts of transgression through description of explicit sets of acts, compels the repetition of those acts to maintain the transgression. And actually, when you're transgressive, you don't even have to do the act, you just need to make sure everyone thinks you do the act. While transgressive hybridity has a place in concrete activations of power shift, resistance comes from negotiations which are forced rather than fun, though they can be both. And I mean, this is the problem, that activism hurts. And it hurts because we're invoking this demon, but we don't really know what it is, and we're creating a pack with things that can't respond to us, and there's a lot of problems I'll get to later. Becomings may also not be aware of the limits they access and challenge, and these limits are usually only encountered accidentally. The purpose and function of becomings are also not known. Well, they're kind of tactically aimed for, but they're not known. So they neither structure their activation nor predict their effects, and of course becomings have no result. Transgression risks subsuming their effects through speech. Transgression is less important than to be seen to transgress. So transgression for its own sake lacks experimentation in its incarnations because it both relies on and reifies the limits it transgresses, not cutting a trajectory across or in between binaries. So Deleuze and Guattari's masochist is zero intensity alone, but not dividuated bodily signified self. The too trendy switch hitter bisexual has no becomings. While entering into different intensities with each gender, the each affirms there are only two. So bisexuality and transvesticism are not hybrid demons, and Deleuze and Guattari, I quote, "Bisexuality is no better a concept than the separateness of the sexes. It is as deplorable to miniaturise, internalise the binary machine as it is to exacerbate it. It does not extricate us from it." Demonological desire refuses the binaries of hetero, homo, bi, and therefore male and female. Demons are the pure indeterminate of nothing and everything, but explicitly of the unspeakable and unrepresentable, not because the demon is aberrant, but because within majoritarian language there are no words. In Becoming, Deleuze and Guattari invoke and encourage in our becomings active evocation of demons and monsters. And there's in a lot of feminist work at the moment, there's this notion of the teratological and the ethics of becoming monster and how we navigate it based on this idea of the authenticity of real-life monsters, which is in itself a problematic term. So, when we talk about these phantasmatic monsters, these monsters that don't exist, maybe this is a way that we can come out of that scary paradigm of speaking for the monster. Becoming sorcerers who raise their own multiplicity pandemonium against a godhead, who animalise state through the horned, hoofed, snouted, howling, smoke, imperceptible entities without evolutionary and taxonomical genesis or zenith. Sorcery is, as they say, a mode of propagation, and the sorcerer never really knows what she will get. Because all becomings have to pass through becoming woman. Of course, we all know this. Like animal language, the language of sorcery does not translate syntactically and, most importantly, paradigmatically or epistemically. Similarly, dragging up, be it toward authenticity or experimentally, maintains the symbol of each gender, which is why transvestites aren't hybrids and therefore aren't demons. An over-symbolised body, even if the symbols jar with each other, is still an explicitly signified body. The horror of making connections is the kind of schiz activist body. So the horror of making connections is activism as a kind of clinical politics, a kind of not being able to help making relations with those we shouldn't be making relations with. Some other examples of, interesting hybrid demons in society are predatory lesbians, of course, because all lesbians are predatory. Butch animals, the hairy-chested feminists, which I've been called, that's where I get the expression from. Animal rights activists are all on the prowl and on the howl because theirs is a speech of desire in a different language, imperceptible and incoherent to majoritarian ears. And one of the interesting things I like about this is because, we've got the Artaud language and the Carol language, and that's all very interesting. And then you have to wait because animals do emit noise, and so at the same time, the growling, howling, hungry dog stomach it is a real sound that a real animal makes, but it's also something that we can emit in a becoming animal. So it stands itself as this fibre or symbiotic threshold. Making a pact with the demon lover abominates us and hybridises desiring collectives. We become sorcerers who invoke their lovers rather than being a part of a structure which limits their selections. So this is another reason why the demon is very interesting, because it isn't the animal, it isn't the woman, it is what we make it, and so we have to be accountable for it. But we don't breed it. This is a quote: "The sorcerer has a relation of alliance with the demon as the power of the anomalous. But demons are not figures or icons. They refer to the becoming of abominable intensity, not a species, but a real fabulation or conceptual persona, which may prevent the dilemmas associated with animal realities or animal subjugation in the becoming animals of the human." There are 4 demonic alliance moments. The first one is the moment of alliance, where we open up and say, I take the demon lover. The second is the borderline, where we realise that coming into this alliance or coming into this love relationship, we have ourselves become threshold. The third is that as we become threshold, we are forced into a creation that bumps against the threshold of others. And then the fourth moment of the demonological alliance, according to Deleuze and Guattari, is probably where ethics comes in, which is that as a result of our creation of a threshold between worlds, we have to have new guides of contagion. So I guess you would say that the point of ethics, the point of activism comes when the new guides of contagion have to occur. So this is the point where inter-kingdom desires must form new trajectories. It's hard because we don't know, so we can't put it down in advance, and this is why activism is so difficult. The demon is a blood filiation with the inhuman abstract, the threshold and the absolute necessity for unnatural participations with political contagions, which is why it's not funky and sexy and cool. It's necessary, it's imperative in activism. Especially the animal, who cannot enter becomings against the subjugating human. Animals cannot negotiate on human paradigms. So how do we enter into something that doesn't really care either way? It just sort of wants to stop being eaten or tortured. The lesbian language is perverse, the female language hysterical, the child's language undeveloped, and the activist's language extreme and dangerous. But you all knew that. Just as the werewolf's howl is a call to desire through mating and hunting, these minoritarian howls threaten through desire and hunting majoritarian language, but they've always been hunted. Like animals, demons are a sonority, and like demons, this is a quote, not only do animals have colours and sounds, but they do not wait for the painter or musician to use those colours and sounds in a painting or music. And this is why I would argue that becoming animal is not a referent or a percept, but a concept, and the relation with the demon can create the activist as a conceptual persona. So our accountable moment comes from the sorcery involved in thought as philosophical creation. Ethically, it is the responsibility of the majoritarian to enter the designified and desubjectified sonorities and saturations of these terms, not to represent them within discursive machines. Becoming animal is not colonising an animal with human perceptions of its nature or characteristics, but finding an escape route from the human. Dog is intensity threshold, but one of the reasons I prefer werewolves is because a dog is a dog. Well, a dog is what we perceive a dog. A dog has characteristics. A werewolf is a fabulation. So the characteristics that a werewolf has are our responsibility to emit. The human becomes all through encroaching on the very intensities which threaten its sanctity. These hybrids exist within what Deleuze and Guattari, after Canetti, called, now let me say this word, enantiomorphosis, which is a regime that involves a hieratic and immutable master who at every moment legislates by constants, prohibiting or strictly limiting metamorphoses, giving figures clear and stable contours, setting forms in opposition. The desiring term is made invisible. The desiring master desires precisely through extricating the self from the object of desire. And this is everything from the Jungian symbols to fluffies. You all know what fluffies are. If you don't, I'm not going to tell you. Zoophiles, I've already told you what they are. That was bad enough. Animal teratology for congenital deformity, and of course the use of speciesist language such as fat pig, stupid cow, pussy, and so on. Hybridity cannot be dissymmetry. Irigaray offers that the breakdown between subject and object, other and same, is desire, and this is a quote, which cannot be equated with that of the masculine world as a result of the way it lives in mucus, end quote. So the relation between the fascinated and the event demonic constitutes a mucosal life. And of course we know demon skin is always slimy. In reference to Lovecraft's monsters, this is where we get into Lovecraft, and I hope that some of you know Lovecraft, but if you don't, then I hope that you will seek Lovecraft, because they mention Lovecraft only in this section like 4 times, and it's fantastic. I mean, it's a really right thing to use, and so I hope that you will seek the Lovecraft. In reference to Lovecraft's monsters, Deleuze and Guattari describe those which begin as, and this is actually a quote from Lovecraft that they quote, teeming, seething, swelling, foaming, spreading like an infectious disease, this nameless horror. And the monsters in Lovecraft begin as these kind of teratological half man, half cephalopod, and end as non-Euclidean. This is a quote from Through the Gates of the Silver Key. Forms of both human and non-human, vertebrate and invertebrate, conscious and mindless, animal and vegetable, which have nothing in common with earthly life, resulting in the nameless summit of agony and dread. Demonic invocation, which traverses the fish-frog-winged cephalopod, enters through the necronomic gates, doors which Deleuze and Guattari claim is a journey that sets scales, the political tactics of Spinozan mediative ethics. And so when Lovecraft talks about, a swelling, foaming horror and the summit of agony and dread, we have to ask agony for whom, dread of what? And, of course, the Lovecraft protagonist is the majoritarian par excellence. Not only is he white and male, he's from Massachusetts. He probably works at Harvard. Oh, sorry, Miskatonic Harvard. Now you'll all go and read Lovecraft. Deleuze and Guattari point that the vampire and the werewolf are parts of bands that transform themselves and each other, monstrous hybrid inter-kingdoms beyond natural kingdoms. So what I've called the unnatural participation. Participation with a dog or another animal is unnatural, but then if you're participating with a thing that is a fabulation, this is an unnatural participation, because if a dog is participating with a man, in that sense, it's also unnatural. And so when you have a werewolf, how do you participate with a werewolf? Well, unnaturally. Emphasising the infinity of inter-kingdom participations. The vampire becomes the bat in Leviticus, a forbidden and aberrant animal because of its inter-kingdom associations as both bird and mammal. I've never seen a vampire turn into a dolphin, but I'm sure that that's pretty aberrant as well because it's a kind of swimming mammal. So let's make a dolphin, Buffy the Dolphin Slayer. Each example of a vampire and werewolf transformation creates a new hybrid. The colonisation through infection of each term by its animal and human qualities teems with new nodes and pulsations as various intensities cross each other for the first time or the next time, where different molecules meet familiarity or as strange combinations. And of course, familiarity is always a choice, and always a choice of perception. Werewolves and vampires are not monsters as spectacle forms, but events which effectuate shifts. The wolf, essentially always part of a pack, infects through the bite. I don't like this bit, so I'm going to skip it. If nature anchors on reproduction, reifying genealogy, and repetition as reiteration, the infective bite of the werewolf or vampire creates the hybrid that is, and this is a quote, sterile, born of a sexual union that will not reproduce itself, but which begins over and again every time. And that's why monsters are never like each other. You never see, well, I guess you could argue you never see identical twin monsters or identical twin... Oh, you see identical twin lesbian vampires. But that's Hammer, and Hammer kind of... They're British, so, they've got the repression thing going on. So Deleuze and Guattari turn to literary literalness, abstract animal as activist becoming, which can't be metaphor or imitation because werewolves and demons and vampires don't exist, except for in the way that we create them as part of our conceptual persona becomings. Decentering anthropomorphism allows non-humans to be without being. Deleuze and Guattari emphasise these animals are not kinds as states, I've already said. In myth and in literature, vampires also transform into fog. And I guess you could say that fog is the visual and tactile representation is the wrong word, experience of sonority. If we hear, then fog is how we feel noise. on a more visual level. Fog is a molecular state, or it's an obviously molecular state. It's inapprehensible, breathed into lungs, obscuring sight, creating an in-between myopia or twilight perception, the time of vampire transformation in the evening, and werewolf metamorphosis in the morning. Now, you all know that werewolves metamorphosize at 4 a.m, don't you? They do. So we've got the twilight and the dawn. Fog seeps into animal, vegetable, mineral and ether. Ubiquitous fog invokes other kinds of hybrid monsters, which begin as hyper-interkingdom animals and eventually other universe and other physics entities and collectives. So in Lovecraft, they exemplify the interkingdom propagation beyond mammalian, animal, vegetable and carbon-based participation. And this is a quote. Lovecraft applies the term outsider to this thing or entity, the thing which arrives and passes at the edge. And Guattari emphasises that desire is always outside. So for Guattari, if desire is always outside, then Lovecraft's outsider is who we are when we are an accountable, desiring persona. So Lovecraft's monster hybrid has gone beyond an unnatural participation. How long am I doing for time? How long have I been going?
26 minutes, 42 seconds.
Groovy. Lovecraft's monster hybrid has gone beyond an unnatural participation to transform the entity as contagion itself. This is a blatant ad for you to read Lovecraft. Walter Gilman in Lovecraft's Dreams in the Witch House is frightened by the human demon rat creature who eats babies, which scuttles around his house. Consequently, this half-half hybrid is replaced by conical, multi-armed entities and bubbling, foaming convergences and divergences. And they live in his house with him, forming a very unnatural family indeed. I don't know if one could Oedipalise a conical convergence. The families of Innismouth in Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innismouth have bred with the fish-frog creatures beneath the sea. The resulting flesh-fish-frog humans are able to reproduce both with each other and with the frog creatures beneath the sea, but each is unique. Their reproduction results in entities, but these offspring never resemble their genesis. And in a way, you could think about this in terms of activism, because we always think about activism as, I'm like you and we're going to fight for the same thing, but actually activism is more tactically available and ethical is if we say, I have nothing to do with you, you have nothing to do with me, but we share this intensity because it must be done, and this is our animal becoming. But the animal's not even here, so what can we do? And I think that the reason for that, which I'll get to later, is because we enter into modes of productions with animals that are not beneficial for them. We're parasitic of them. And so it is our responsibility and our accountability to try and think of tactics of animal becomings that don't fetishise them, but also don't continue to slaughter them. So gender, sexual union, genus and non-individuation do not prevent offspring in Innismouth, but do prevent reproduction as repetition. Lovecraft eventually offers imperceptible entities, including the becoming imperceptible of human characters, such as Randolph Carter, whose hybrid form is that of the simultaneously conscious and mindless, not present to himself. Here the hybrid is estranged from itself, and especially in Lovecraft, other demons and gods emerge, evoking transformation rather than the empty simulacrum, reiterations enforced through religion, capitalism and other regimes of desire. And they go on to talk about things in Lovecraft, which I don't talk about the kind of when you go through slices, and so the Lovecraft characters become two-dimensional, three-dimensional, four-dimensional, mindless, and to the end dimension. But they're still very much voluminously there. Werewolves, vampires, flesh, fish, frog people, gender ambiguities and perverts are hybrid becomings. The focus here is on transformative potentialities or germinalities, interstices and qualities of each term, and the unique vibrations produced as the specific intensities enter within each other. Contagion is movement. Werewolves and vampires transform into melded thresholds. Deleuze and Guattari's threshold collapses the analogous proportion gap rather than splicing the terms into two demarcated halves stuck onto each other. The unnatural alliance closes the gap of proportionality, whereby strange relations are created that challenge the like-for-like sets of binaries that are often used covertly to give some minoritarians power as long as they continue to oppress others. And this is one thing that I really despise. It's this kind of selecting your minoritarian of the week. So, I'm too busy thinking about feminism to think about animal rights, or I'm too busy to think about animal rights, I'm thinking about the environment, that kind of the false antagonism that really does nothing. And it does create a very unaccountable pretend activism. So in fellow logocentric society, women get equality as long as they don't forget to be women and don't become ambiguous. Homosexuality is okay, but don't let in the queers. We, the collective human we, treat animals better because we enslave them organically, but we eat them just the same. Traditional relations demand the minoritarian come up to the dominant. Unnatural alliances are molecular entrances into something else's politics, desires, alliances that traverse proportion and proportionality rather than swap it or change places with it within the maintained hierarchy. Now, this kind of summit of agony that Lovecraft talks about comes because we're entering into something else's politics, but the something else is actually not present to us, so nonetheless we have to do it. Now, this is an incredibly difficult and painful thing to do, nonetheless we have to do it. A line of flight cuts across, not up or down, and thus its trajectory is hybrid, as it doesn't know the qualities of its journey. Transformation is not an act. The hybrid has no past, no birth born of a monstrous union, or a collapse of two symbolic qualities. The werewolf never starts or ends wolf or man, but constantly unfolds and reorients its werewolfish aspects and force. The vampire is a femme male seductive monster, infecting. And usually in film it infects women with lesbianism, and also vampirism is a disease. And continually now we're looking at films and representations where we have the biological warfare, be that digital biology or physiological biology. The lesbian vampire has created a genre of monster all of her own. If, as Wittig states, lesbians are not women, perhaps lesbian vampires are not vampires, but yet another becoming term towards which we can resonate and towards which critics of Becoming Woman could latch on. Lovecraft's Innsmouth folk and the non-Euclidean elder gods are monsters without genealogy or destiny and are, to varying degrees, imperceptible, while nonetheless being present and effective, and he also says they're outside of space and time. Perhaps I could suggest that these new gods, which demand a forsaking of regimes, transform sexuality to a mystical desire, and Guattari states, sexual liberation is a mystification. Liberation will occur when sexuality becomes desire, and desire is the freedom to be sexual, that is, to be something else at the same time. Which is also a point of ethical activism, because we have to be something else at the same time, because being ourselves alone is maintaining our position. So when Guattari talks about this, sexual liberation is mystification, it's also a very accountable ethics, an imperative. This understanding of desire negotiates Foucault's disdain for the concept of desire, which for him suggests, and I quote, the medical and naturalist connotations that the notion of desire entails. Tell me what you desire and I will tell you who you are. Now, of course, you can say, I desire animals, I desire women, I am becoming whatever. But sorcery begins with love for demons, and we can't reduce love for demons to a pathological state, although we could try, and I'd like to see someone do it because it'd probably be one of the most interesting nosology books ever. Demons in neither medical nor natural sciences are verifiable. They are inherently unnatural and resist naturalisation. Because they cannot be placed within taxonomy. They move too fast or too slow and transform with non-causal velocity, and especially when they enter into imperceptible participations, cannot perceive themselves. So, of course, we are demonised. We, as they, cannot speak a language that can be heard, so we cannot tell, ergo cannot be. Because we are always singular instances, which is the second memory of the sorcerer, we do not have a language of our own, only resonant sonorities with other entities. The medical and the social study of aberrations from congenital monsters to queers could be resisted through a politics of hybridity, which requires the hybrid to be part of a pack that collects those who do not resemble each other. Collective nouns collect entities based not so much on their filiations, but the desire to extricate them from forming unnatural participations with those belonging to different kingdoms. Collective nouns do not collect per se, their borders are infinite, their instances are within rather than beyond. Collective nouns are created because collectives cannot be quarantined. They excavate the myth of purity of kingdoms and kinds. They are always already within society, not alienated from it. A politics or ethics of hybridity requires a tentative individual volition towards a verbing, not nouning, born of a need to mobilise majoritarian patterns, not be included within these patterns. Hybridity signs the pact, the tenets of which include willingness to repudiate the fantasy of purity of self, of sexuality as subjectivity, of bi-univocal definition, of belonging to one kingdom. Hybridity is a permanent experiment that makes the self its own phylum, both always alone and also not known as self to self, and so it hurts. Hybrids are made up of molecular intensities, many of which are unexpected, but some of which come from the initial desire toward becomings. These could be described as the political aspects of becomings. Entering into a hybridity loses the self in order to think through another trajectory, in order to advocate political shifts in society without retaining the dialectic of advocate-victim, even if the advocate is the victim, which reifies the self as subject rather than as negotiating a condition of oppression. This is the key issue for Lyotard in his work on the différende, as he demands the turn from the individual and the capacity to speak for the victim, or from their perspective on the victim, what Lyotard calls the silences. Guattari would suggest that while a dialectic advocacy, desire or infection is a transference from molar man to molar wolf, from traditional hetero to nomenclatured transgressive, an ecosophical creation of unnatural alliances are traversal, a mobile, teeming, existential territory. So maybe werewolves and vampires could be considered the finite existential territory of a becoming term, but because they are abstract, they are ubiquitous, because Guattari also talks about that only through abstraction can we actually negotiate an ethical, interactive becoming, because it is able to be applied to situations based on relevance and mediation. A pack of wolves are all different and all the same at once. The monsters in Lovecraft cannot apprehend their own being, as non-Euclidean physics is beyond traditional possibilities of perception. Like feminists, queers and political activists, these demonic assemblages think, speak and live according to different logics or negotiative practices. They are being, doing and relating differently, an abstract machine. Explicitly, this is not metaphoric, but thought as material and materiality as thought. Packs think, but they never know. They do not know themselves as individuals within a pack or a pack within the world, but their different thinking or logic activates change. And I guess this is, if you have the werewolf, or say the activist who advocates for the entity that it can never know, i.e. an animal activist, then that would be the plane of consistency, and then the paradigm shift that occurs as a result of that activism would create a new plane of consistency. Monsters are fascinating and create fascinating unnatural alliances through the formation of a relation between the fascinated and the monster, collapsing the dialectic into a hybrid. No escape, no line of flight that can be reversed or retracted. Fascination is an irreversible making queer assemblage, and this is a quote. This real abstract is totally different from the fictitious abstraction of the supposedly pure machine of expression. Abstract machines thus have proper names as well as dates, which of course designate not persons or subjects, but matters and functions, end quote. Can we use fascination as a term to negotiate desire as a longing for an entity without the possibility of desire being satisfied through a dialectic coupling with the entity, or indeed without knowing the entity and the self, which is essentially what happens in all activism? As psychoanalytic desire is to satisfaction, is transpositional teratology, hybridity fascination to packing. The infective werewolf evokes both shared wolfing and irresolvable differences within the pack. The devil, with which we make a pact, announces in the Bible, and Deleuze and Guattari quote the Bible, I am legion, and the devil continues in the Bible to say, for we are many. Animal, vegetable, imperceptible becomings require nothing more than other form, otherworldly pack perception. Advocacy demands a territory shifting function without resolution. Infection recruits to shift planes of desire, which are the sacred and the profane, the sexual and the secular, the act, object and flow of the activism toward becoming inhuman. And by inhuman, what I mean is shifting away from this zenith of the human. And Serres, Blanchot, Lyotard and Deleuze and Guattari they use varying degrees of inhuman, ahuman, unhuman, and so all of them see the category of the human as primary. So this is why I'd kind of argue that the human is a more crucial term for renegotiation at the moment than, say, the gender bifurcation. Activism is grace as a stepping aside from what Michel Serres calls egology. It's a skits activism, that is, it makes connections which don't make sense, they don't have an end game. These connections hurt and they need a function, they are never sealed. Activism is a plane of consistency. Demonology activism is a circle slice of the Dogon sphere, which is the Humpty Dumpty egg, but in Body Without Organs, it's the Hindu Dogon sphere, of the ethics of alterity, which is becoming. Thank you.